Good afternoon, everyone.
Hello.
Welcome. We have the coveted after lunch spot. So the crowd gets some energy going. Hope that's nice. We also have a great topic in store for you. It's one that has never been controversial and people typically are not opinionated about it. We're going to talk about compensation. So we're looking forward to not only getting your questions here at the end, but I would love to learn more from Rani, who I've been really excited to talk to. We've already, I'm talking to you like several hours now at this point.
Yeah.
Just asking repeated questions.
There's a lot to say about compensation, folks.
Absolutely. So to start out, let's talk about what is on the mind of founders and the clients that you've been working with on the foundation building out kind of a compensation philosophy or compensation within their business.
Absolutely. It's a great question. And before I kick off here, I'd actually love to survey the crowd and get a sense for who's in the room today. Any folks that are hiring managers or people managers here in the audience?
I guess that counts as me,
that
too.
Counts as me, too, I guess. Any folks that are in an executive role? Wow, that's great. And how many of you have had questions about compensation come up in the last, let's say 2 weeks, in the last 2 weeks alone? Great, so quite a few folks as well. I don't think you're alone, for what it's worth. Compensation is one of the topics that tends to become very popular, especially at the end of year mark. And so to go back to your question, Taylor, I'd say that right now what clients are really focused on are one of three things, right? The first is committing to a philosophy around compensation, which is how do you want to decide pay? Are you going to have a bonus structure? How do you structure your equity? Is that options or RSUs, some combination of the two? Are you going to have a refresh program? All of these are opportunities to communicate your values and, again, think about how that impacts how you both attract top talent, but then also retain the folks that you already have. So that's really the first piece of what folks are thinking about for compensation. The second is scaling it. And I think that's probably what's top of mind for all of you who raised your hands as hiring managers, right? My team was a group of 3. Now we're about to become a group of 9. How do we think about scaling compensation in a way that feels fair and equitable? And so for a lot of these teams, budget, the scary B word, comes up. They're thinking about what those budgets are. And then the other piece is how do they think about that in a very long-term perspective? So consistency, really critical for compensation. We'll talk more about that later today, I'm sure. The last piece that I encourage everyone, both candidates, employees, managers, executives, whoever you are in this room today, is communication of compensation. Really making sure that you understand why you are being compensated the way you are and how those decisions are made. That's what our startup customers are really trying to drive home, especially in this more uncertain economic climate.
Can you use this word budget, I believe? My CFO keeps using this word, as I'm sure many in the crowd can empathize with.
If you're on the finance team, you can plug your ears for that part.
So when it comes to looking at what other companies may be doing, what are some of the things that you would coach founders or people that are building out this compensation as far as benchmarking to other companies or maybe taking some great ideas from other companies?
Yeah, so popping off the stack, actually, before we talk about benchmarking, something that companies generally have to commit to as a part of that philosophy is how do you think about your global versus domestic strategy? Right, and this is top of mind for companies like Turing, but also startups that for the past 2 years were really just hiring wherever they found great talent. And it's an excellent strategy, but we're actually starting to see the rise of a lot more compliance and regulation around this too. So when we think about compensation, there are a lot of different ways it can be structured, but the most generous, and I'd say like the most free-spirited, is what we call global pay. So regardless of where you're from, regardless of where you live, and if you move a couple times over, you're always going to be paid the same amount. Then there are geo-pay strategies, which are largely for a specific country or a state where everyone within those locales are making the same amount. And then we have city level, which honestly was a pretty unique area to look at in the United States during 2020 because of how many people were moving out of, even San Francisco or New York, and how folks would respond to that, and with their employees changing and moving rather rapidly too, right? So when folks commit to one of these philosophies, that's generally where benchmarking becomes more important, because if you're benchmarking to a tier 1 city like San Francisco or New York, sometimes that can be 30 or 40% more than what we call tier 2 or tier 3 cities. And so benchmarking is one of those areas that it's really, really important to ensure that you have a strategy around where you hire before you start pulling benchmarks. The other piece that I'll mention is that as much as we like to say that companies are data-driven, benchmarks are not always the complete picture. Again, bringing up the B word of budgets, but often companies have finite resources. And so that requires being really creative around how they respond to employee needs. And so something that we always advise customers to look at when they look at benchmarking is if you are making a one-time benchmarking adjustment for 10% for all of your employees, if you had to do that for the next 10 years, what would that look like? Because you are now setting the expectation that when you're adjusting to benchmarks, you're going to be consistent about it, and that is market data that you are willing to trust.
And that was something you mentioned to me yesterday that I just want to really draw attention to, and I've already copyrighted it, so don't worry about that piece. But this idea of if you're trying to come up with a philosophy and you're implementing it, you should think in that decade term of what's going to scale over the next decade, both for your capital allocation, but also for your culture in the company. And I thought that was something that really stood out to me. Now, you create a great compensation philosophy, then it comes to transparency, not only in being clear of what your philosophy is, but how do you relay that to folks? What are some things that you've seen as best practices as being ahead of kind of the transparency trend that we're seeing?
Yeah, one thing I'll share here that has resonated with me actually for the last few days as we've been prepping customers for some new regulations in 2023 is we looked at some data around how many employees thought they were being paid fairly. And over 50% of employees that were making above market rates actually thought they were not being paid fairly because they didn't understand how their compensation was structured. That is pretty alarming. And that's not just the responsibility of an HR team, a people team, a recruiter. It's hiring managers, it's executives at companies are required to help communicate this education. And so going back to your question around transparency, one of the big regulations that's changing here in 2023 in California is for any company that has 15 or more employees, you're now going to be required to share pay bands on every single job description that you put up there. So what some companies do is they say, all right, we don't actually know what our pay bands are. We're going to say it's 20K to 400K for this role. And it's amusing at first, but it can be really frustrating for candidates who are looking at this for the first time. And so really what we help our customers think about and what we recommend putting thought into is how are you first going to decide what that ladder looks like? So this role, the role below it, the role above it. So a software engineer 2 versus a software engineer 1 versus a software engineer 3. Really understanding that progression. And then also understanding what are the heuristics that go into making the decision around where someone falls on that band. Is it their credentials? Is it their interview performance? Is it who's advocating for them at the company? And that's also another way that you can really stand out and be transparent by actually telling them, here is how we're going to make the decision around how you're going to be compensated within our company. We're actually already starting to see this, by the way. If you look at a few companies and how they've been sharing these job postings, they're breaking it down and also sharing if you move to another city that isn't one of these tier 1 cities, here's what your compensation would be expected.
Yeah, and I think your point around having that 20 to 400,000 candidates could just flip the script on you and go, sure, I'll take between 100 and 400,000, right? Like provide that same range back to you. So I think that's incredibly important to have real meaningful, transparent ranges. Now, if founders or leaders are deciding to bring in-house a compensation team and may not know how to vet a compensation expert, what would be some tips from them that you would have?
Yeah, absolutely. One other piece, I just want to go back to the transparency piece, and I promise I'll connect it back to hiring a comp team, is that the highest comp doesn't always win. And I want everyone in this room to take a second, you too, Taylor, on the last time you took your job. What were the factors that you considered? I'm sure compensation was a part of it. Was it the people you met in the interview process? Was it the sector or space that you were interviewing for? Was it Were there other people at the company that you had known from before, right? Like, what was your impetus for joining? And we actually find that younger folks, especially Gen Z, tend to really prioritize career growth, right? So maybe it's not even just being transparent around compensation. It goes a lot further than that. How are you going to talk about career progression and be transparent about it? So in terms of compensation and how to hire that team, it's an incredibly personal decision because we find that founders have varying levels of education themselves around how to make comp decisions. But one of the first pieces that we generally look for, especially with tech companies that are scaling quickly, is get folks who have done it before. Get folks who have actually been at a company where they've had to make these type of equity or cost of living adjustments and really been at a company for a long period of time. The other, which sounds rather simple, is find folks that agree with your values. We see folks that, have pretty lower, in terms of benchmarking, they're benchmarking on the lower percentile for base salary, but are actually making their employees really significant equity stakeholders of the company. We have other folks that are startups that say, we don't want you to feel like you have to compromise to work at a startup. We're going to pay you what the Googles and Facebooks of the world might pay you, and that's what you're going to get. You don't have to compromise. Both of those structures imply very different planning and something you have to be in lockstep with a compensation team to really make sure that's something that scales over time.
And you've had a really unique view of working with so many different leaders, different industries, different size organizations. What are some of the pitfalls that you've seen and helped them out of?
This might be something that we survey the crowd on for pitfalls of compensation. It's a great question, and I think the pitfalls even change depending on the stage of company that you work for, right? One of the ones that we're hearing quite a bit right now, again, in lieu of this pay transparency that is starting to take hold here in California, is making sure that your external expectations and communication standards are compliant and aligned with what you have internally. It sounds simple, right? But if you have a job posting for a product manager that says 140 to 180K, you do not want a product manager within your company making 130, right? So leveling those expectations is one of the pitfalls that I definitely think is really important. The second piece I would say is actually, especially around this time where a lot of companies are planning for the new year, is whenever you make a compensation decision, expect to make it for the rest of the company's history. Right? If you're going to be doing these cost of living adjustments, really make sure that that's something that you want to continue to do time and time again. We find that compensation, and Taylor is really one to advocate for this, is one of the best vessels you have as an executive for building trust with your employees. I can remember the name of my manager who sat me down and explained compensation to me the very first time, because that felt like a moment where she didn't have to do that, but made me feel a lot more stable and comfortable around how those decisions were being made. It really goes a long way.
Those are great tips along the way. And for individuals themselves, what type of feedback would you have or ideas for their own advocacy in their career and how to handle compensation?
Yeah, I saw a lot of hands go up for the hiring manager or the people managers as well as the executives in the room. So I'm going to give a two-part answer to this.
Love it.
For folks that are the employee or potentially maybe on the job market soon, the first thing that I would really recommend leveraging is read up on these transparency laws. So there are actually a lot of insightful questions that you can ask now as a candidate, like, how long has this band been around? Or can you tell me how you're going to decide whether I'm placed here or there? How are you going to decide my level at the company? What is my title going to be? And you are entitled to asking and getting answers to those questions. And if for whatever reason you get a slightly murky answer to any of those questions, that is a reflection of the employer you're about to consider, right? So in many cases, try to develop that confidence in the company, the growth, the business, and back that into your strategy for choosing a company and a future employer. For the folks here that are a hiring manager or potentially an executive as well, I really think all it takes is going above and beyond with your direct reports and setting up time to talk about compensation. I think it is so unfair that folks like Taylor and a few other folks I met even before this think that compensation is something restricted to HR and people teams, because it absolutely is not. In fact, even in our own process of building and scaling Complete, we've found that there are engineering leaders, there are product managers, there are even marketing leaders who want to make sure that compensation is talked about in the right way. And so every time that a manager can kind of take that step to say, hey, let's talk about how your comp is structured here. What are your expectations for your career? And you can actually have those conversations in tandem.
One of the things you mentioned backstage was for executives.
Backstage conversation coming on front stage.
This is a big deal. I hope you're nervous now. But not having executives delegate away thinking about compensation strategy was something that you said that really stood out to me. So even if they have an HR team or total rewards team, never delegating away entirely that strategy, because it is such a selling point. Aside from calling you out now on stage about that, anything else to add to that? Because I just thought that really resonated with me.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that a lot of exceptional leaders already do today, and I think he may not be upset about me putting him on the spotlight for a second here. But one of our angel investors, his name is Will Larson. He is the CTO of a company called Comp. And he actually has this conversation with his engineering team around how are different economic principles being applied to compensation, right? So a lot of folks think that inflation is how you make decisions around compensation. Not quite. There are a lot of other factors that go into making long-term market adjustments like cost of living. And so Will took the responsibility upon himself to create this presentation around what is the economy saying? How does that translate to compensation? And what does that mean for you here at our company? I think that type of initiative is really what's going to retain employees more than any type of salary or equity increase you give them.
Absolutely. And we'll get to questions here in just a moment. Is there anything that you being a founder of an organization that you would have liked to know when you started, that you now know?
Great question. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is that compensation, despite it having this very compliance-y connotation at times, really, if you're at a party and you don't want to talk to the person you're talking to, bring up compensation. Fastest way to get out of it.
I tell them I work in HR.
Exactly,
every time.
Right? HR, all right, I'll go talk to someone else. But really, when I think about compensation, it can be incredibly creative. I don't think founders realize that. I don't think I realized that, right? Everything from your vesting schedule. You don't have to do the 1-year cliff and 4-year vesting schedule. In fact, we saw companies experiment with the 1-year vesting schedule even during COVID to attract top talent. Even things like token compensation. And I know it's kind of a hot topic in crypto right now, but having token comp, that's a whole new class of compensation that's been introduced, right? So there really are ways to codify your values and principles in compensation, and I encourage every founder who's starting a company to really use that and leverage it.
Crypto. Has there been a lot going on in crypto recently, or?
I wouldn't really know.
We'll leave that to later.